Art Museum and our centennial year. It's wonderful as always to see so many people filling the Open Fritz Gallery and participating in our winter lecture series. Both members and friends, we're really delighted to have you here because it is for you and because of you that this institution is coming. The lecture today is dedicated in honor of Coralie Gibbs, longtime member, trustee, head of the institution, director, and friend. And we're so delighted that Cora is here today. I'm sure you'll have a chance to speak with her during our tea following the lecture. These lectures would not be possible without the dedicated work of our Winter Lecture Series Committee under the leadership of Dick Hunt and the generous support of our sponsors. I'd like to take a minute to acknowledge both the committee's work and to thank our sponsors, Ronald Lee Fleming II, Denise L. Roberts, George and Anita Furbish, Cynthia and Robert Sinclair, Robin and Fred Warren, Johanna and Ronald Becker, Margot and Dick Grosvenor, and Dick Hunt. So please give everybody a good round of applause. On your chairs, you no doubt noticed a brief survey. Gail Hargraves, our marketing director, would love to have you fill it out if you haven't already filled it out. Those of you who completed it in earlier lectures, you have no need to fill it out. And she will be in the back of the room at the end with pencils if you need them, but also to collect the surveys that you have done. At the end of the lecture, please make your way swiftly to our right gallery, to the Drury Gallery, and to the library for a wonderful tea reception. And be sure to notice the sponsors who are contributing to the success of our teas. There are signs on all the tables. These businesses are providing the wonderful nourishment that we have. And so as you go about your day in the community, please be sure to thank them and let them know how appreciative the Newport Art Museum is of their donations. And finally, it's always a good moment to notice our 4 exits in the case that we had an emergency and you had to leave. Go to the closest one, please. And also check your cell phones so that if they are alive, they're at least silenced. It gives me great pleasure to turn the podium over to committee member Margot Grosvenor and to welcome all of you once again. Thank you.
Good afternoon. This gives me so much pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker today. We have known him for a number of years, and we have treasured knowing him. Over the past 25 years, William Vareika Fine Arts Limited has grown into one of the largest and most respected galleries in the United States, specializing in the purchase and sale of important 18th, 19th, and 20th century works of art. How could this kind of success happen to a young magna cum laude graduate of Boston College who was headed for law school? The way William Vareika explains it is that during his undergraduate years, he happened to take a class in art history. He became interested in the work of a stained glass artist named John Farge, who had decorated the windows in the Congregational Church in Newport. He decided to spend the summer in Newport and became involved in the church's struggle to survive. He met and married the lovely Allison, and together they settled in Newport to raise a family and to establish an art gallery on Bellevue Avenue. Just imagine, only one art class made all the difference. For more than 20 years, Vareika has used his gallery to raise public awareness about a variety of charitable causes and has donated thousands of dollars in works of art to support other nonprofit organizations. He was instrumental in acquiring 13 John Lafarge stained glass windows, circa 1890, that were restored and installed in Salve Regina's recently constructed Our Lady of Mercy Chapel. In addition, he established the Wayne Vareika Fine Arts for Arts and Public Policy, which is presented annually to a graduating senior who demonstrates an appreciation or talent for art as well as a social conscience. Last year, he was awarded an honorary doctorate degree of Humane Letters at Salve Regina University for the university's 61st commencement. His support of local organizations is legendary. The list goes on and on. But before the introduction overwhelms the speaker's allotted time, I am very proud to present to you Dr. William Vareika.
When Margot asked me several months ago to speak as part of this winter lecture series, I was at first reluctant, as I am very shy of public speaking and also quite busy. But the more that I thought about the fact that this would be the Cora Lee Gibbs lecture, and that it was part of the centennial year celebration of this institution, I decided that I really had no choice but to agree to be with you today. And as Margot told me that I could speak on any topic that I wished, it was also clear to me what my topic should be, as there are so many common threads that are woven together to create the fabric of my life in Newport, the enduring art of William Truss Richards as part of the rich artistic heritage of Newport and the Narragansett Bay, and the centenary of the Newport Art Museum. As fate would have it, as Margot mentioned, I arrived in Newport in June of 1974, a recent idealistic college graduate, committed to volunteer to lead an effort to save the endangered John Lafarge decorated Newport Congregational Church, which I naively imagined would happen over the summer months before commencing law school. I had fortuitously discovered Lafarge, as Margot said, in 1971. In the one art history course I had taken as a sophomore political science pre-law major at Boston College. My professor encouraged me to develop my exhaustive term paper on Lafarge into a thesis and possibly a book. And in my senior year, that effort brought me in 1974 for the first time to the Newport where the artist had lived off and on from 1859 until his death in 1910. In 1859, Lafarge had taken a leave from law studies in New York at the suggestion of friend Richard Morris Hunt, the architect, in order to try his hand at art in a serious way in the Church Street Newport studio of Richard's brother, William Morris Hunt. Many years later, on July 5th, my birthday, in 1912, this studio building was leased by a group of artists and civic-minded Newporters to become the first home of the newly formed Art Association of Newport, now the Newport Art Museum and Art Association, probably the oldest community art association in America. Of course, in 1916, the association moved to the Griswold House, and here are images of the Hunt Studio, which stood about where the swimming pool of the Viking Hotel is currently situated. The fight to save the Lafarge Church took many years in the courts, and as I continued to postpone my law school plans, I needed to eat and pay rent. In 1974, I was fortunate to have been offered a job as the part-time custodian and picture installer at the Art Association. By virtue of this position, I was asked to join the Exhibitions and Collections Committee, and I have continued to serve on this committee for 38 years. My work at the Art Association and on the crusade to save the Lafarge Church not only enhanced my knowledge and interest in art and historic and cultural preservation, but those experiences also introduced me at a formative age to a host of interesting and civic-minded individuals who would become models and mentors as I came to age in Newport. These people taught me, inspired me, and opened doors for me in the world of art that would later become my career. They also provoked me to support noble causes. One of my first projects at the Art Association involved the major installation of outdoor sculpture called Monumenta in 1974. This included working on the famous Christo wrapping of the cove at Kings Beach on the Ocean Drive, the brainchild of Bill and Gail Crimmins. Monumenta was repeated again in 1976, where I assisted the soft sculptress, Ann Healy, with her installations here at the Art Association, as you can see in the vintage image at the upper right. Also in 1976, I helped hang an exhibition of Dick Grosvenor's artwork in this very room, and that began a long relationship that I have had with the Grosvenor family. One of the most influential assignments of my early days associated with this institution was the installation of a major exhibition of the work of William Truss Richards at the Art Association in the winter of 1976. Coincidentally, a number of the artworks that I hung in that show I later owned as an art dealer. And to give you an idea of how the market has evolved in my time, Richard's watercolors that were sold at the 1976 exhibition for hundreds of dollars, 20 years later, I sold for tens of thousands. Perhaps my most productive day working at the Art Association was the one when I was asked to inventory the sparse contents of the Swanhurst Mansion on Bellevue Avenue, which at that time was owned by the association but rarely used and later sold. At lunchtime, as I sat in the grungy attic eating my sandwich, I noticed a pile of vintage newspapers covered in dust and pigeon droppings. Curious, I wanted to check out the date and the old news. As I lifted a pile, dropping to the floor was an unframed, matted drawing. On close inspection, I realized it was by Winslow Homer. And today it remains one of the most valuable artworks in the museum collection, and also a mystery as to how it found its way to the attic and where it had come from. On January 24th, 1976, I was honored to deliver in this room one of the Abby Kingsley Norman lectures, the predecessor of this winter lecture series, now in its 85th year. You can see a marble bust of Ms. Norman, who endowed the earliest series out in the hallway. My topic was John Lafarge, American Artist, a Bicentennial Reappraisal. Not to alarm you, as I promised to adhere to my 60-minute allotment. At age 24, I had never given a public lecture, and Marion Carey, the chair of the lecture committee, actually had to call for an intermission at a point so that those who wished to leave or use the restroom could, as the lecture went on for a full 2 hours. In fact, happily, very few chose to leave and were forgiving of the overly enthusiastic proponent of the then forgotten artist. Coincidentally, the very next month, my friend Linda Ferber, former curator and director at the Brooklyn Museum, gave a lecture here on William Truss Richards, no doubt to accompany the exhibition I helped to install. I must acknowledge Dr. Ferber's groundbreaking scholarship on Richards throughout her long career. She very much influenced my interest and my work. It is interesting to note how young the field of American art history is, and that in the 1970s, neither Lafarge nor Richards were known beyond the small circle of scholars, serious collectors, family members, and family acquaintances. The Art Association also became a social center for me as a young man, and I made many friends through the years here. I even dated several of the young artists and art school teachers. One of my lady friends actually convinced me to model in a life drawing class, fortunately fully clothed. On the slide, as you see, is an image of a 1981 Art Association student exhibition in this very room, in which hang two of the painted results of this class. Just yards from here, I met my wife for the first time as she sat for a portrait in this artist's studio. In time, I realized that I had an aptitude and passion for buying and selling art. I found that I had a knack for spotting an undervalued work of art in very modest settings: yard sales, junk and antique shops, country auctions, and the like. I found that I could adequately supplement my pay from the Art Association, which I initially received in cash, on each Friday from the petty cash box in Alonga Rogers' office, the small room off of the Drury Gallery, which she shared with her two basset hounds, by working at the lowest form of art dealer, the picker, in order to support myself during my volunteer days to save the church. Mrs. Rogers, my old friend Peter Dutra, who later worked for me at my gallery for many years, and I were the only paid staff at the Art Association in those early days. Volunteer committees ran the place under the presidency of the venerable Bruce Howe. Later, in 1974, Judith Richardson Sylvia was hired as the first professional director, followed by Elaine Lorillard in 1977. Two very glamorous, talented, and well-connected women who were responsible for bringing this institution into the 20th century. They brought to Newport a number of very important and current exhibitions. Judith passed away in 2004 at too young an age. Elaine Lorillard, also known as the founder of the Newport Jazz Festival, became one of my closest friends. She passed away in 2007 at a very young 93. Here is an image taken in 1982 at the opening reception of a Cushion Gallery exhibition of the Swiss national artist Hans Erni that I curated through connections in the art world and installed as a member of the Exhibitions and Collections Committee. Newport poet Charles Norman and his wife Diana are to my left. In 1986, I was asked to join the Board of Trustees of what had become in 1983, under the enlightened presidency of Dick Grosvenor, the Newport Art Museum and Art Association, as part of a change not only of name, but a philosophy of becoming a more professional arts institution. Coralie Gibbs came on board as executive director in 1985, and her long tenure is one of the most productive in the history of the institution. Cora remains today one of the most respected and beloved members of the Newport Art Museum family and the Rhode Island arts community at large. After her retirement as director, Cora joined the board at my strong insistence, and her wisdom is still called upon as board historian, director emerita, and as a member of the Collections and Exhibitions Committee. Because of my long associations with the museum, when Allison and I decided to be married in 1987, we were honored to be offered the museum's Griswold building as the site for the reception. I am sure that this was the first wedding reception held in the museum's history, as it was long before the potential for wedding rentals was envisioned. Here you can see our wedding portrait in the library in front of the portrait of Maud Howe Elliott, museum founder, and in the Drury Gallery on the left, in front of the door to what was Mrs. Rogers' office, and standing with Cora Gibbs besides the museum's prize, Richard's Oil, off the South Shore. The same year, I attended a reception on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the founding of the museum, where I read a citation honoring longtime art teacher Marion Carey, who had come to the art school staff in 1927 and who had introduced me at my Lafarge lecture. You can see me sitting next to Marion Carey and Hope Drury Goddard, Lisa's mother-in-law, who was a longtime board member. I spent 20 years on the museum board. One of my proudest accomplishments was authoring the museum mission statement that identified an exhibitions and collections policy that emphasized the rich artistic heritage of Newport and the Narragansett Bay region and the thriving Newport area living arts community. It was my contention that this institution was destined for greatness and distinction by virtue of its location in one of the most important settings in the history of our American culture. And as I believe that the story of the arts in Newport told the story of the arts in America, the Newport Art Museum could make a national contribution by focusing on what no other art museum in the world had, a Newport address. Cora Gibbs made her mark on the history of this institution by her efforts to promote and enforce this specialization, and her tenure that coincided initially with the board leadership of Bruce Sumner has made the museum what it is today. The effort to build the addition to the Cushing Gallery and the climate-controlled storage facility in the Cushing basement at this time coinciding with the campaign to increase the holdings of the museum collection with examples of important art created in Newport, past and present. With limited resources, it was understood that our small museum could not compete with larger established institutions for major shows of varied international art subject matter, but we could make our mark by specializing in what was unique to our community. From time to time, I have heard mainly newer board members question the wisdom of this Newport mission, and I am pleased that the majority of board members continue to endorse the philosophy behind it. As a married man, my law school plan had evaporated, and I had by necessity become more serious about my art dealing career, which I conducted at this time out of my home, just 2 blocks away. As my academic interest was the important American artists who had been attracted to Newport and the Narragansett Bay region in the 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries, and not the local school of those artists lucky enough to have been born here. This interest also became the focus of my art business. The rich Newport artistic heritage was due to several factors. The wealth associated with the shipping center of colonial Newport created an atmosphere that attracted the leading portrait painters, furniture makers, and silversmiths in the 18th century. The unparalleled natural beauty and healthy climate of the coastal community helped to attract more year-round and seasonal residents in the 19th century. The Redwood Library and Athenaeum, strong, diverse religious institutions, and the unique history created an intellectual climate that attracted writers, scientists, and artists who enjoyed the company of fellow creative thinkers. Founded in 1871, the Town and Country Club was the predecessor of the Newport Art Association. Wealthy summer residents provided a patron class if they could afford to acquire painted tokens of remembrance of Newport that would adorn year-round homes in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and elsewhere. It was to this Newport society that artists like John Lafarge and William Truss Richards flocked in the second half of the 19th century. The list, as you see, is a virtual who's who of the important artists active in America during this period. In my view, there is no other community in the country, apart from New York, that can boast of this extraordinary artistic heritage. I found success offering works of this tradition as a private dealer, but found that I was selling these works to collectors throughout the country, while Rhode Islanders were unaware of these works or my thesis of the importance of this region in the history of the arts. It was for this reason that Allison and I decided to open our public Bellevue Avenue Gallery in the spring of 1987 to present exhibitions that reflect this heritage. Our inaugural exhibition was a show of the art of William Truss Richards. The next year, we mounted a major John Lafarge exhibit. I am pleased to note that throughout the years, we have now probably handled more artworks by Lafarge and Richards than anyone in history. I show on the screen the first work by Lafarge that I ever owned, a little 1881 watercolor and gouache of the shore, which I sold to the National Gallery of Art. And also the first William Truss Richards that I owned, a splendid 1876 watercolor entitled When First We Built Our Castle by the Sea, which was on the cover of the invitation to the grand opening of our gallery in 1987. Of all of the interesting artists associated with Newport, I have chosen to speak in some depth about Richards today for several reasons. Richards is one of the most beloved artists in Newport history. Unlike most of the artists who came to Newport to paint and stayed in hotels and boarding houses before moving on, Richards made Newport his home and raised his family here. The artist's first biographer and one of his friends and patrons was Harrison Morris, president of both the Art Association of Newport and the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Morris wrote, quote, "No artist has been better loved in Newport than William Truss Richards, first of American marine painters. When after his death, the Art Association acquired one of his pictures through subscription of its members and friends, old sea dogs and fishermen came to contribute their bit because they had known and loved the painter." And this, in fact, is the painting that Mr. Morris was referring to, which was acquired for the museum collection in 1922. This museum has assembled one of the best collections of Richards artworks of any museum in the United States. And the summer 2012 Centennial exhibition here will feature the loan of a very important Richards collection that I was intimately involved with and about which I will speak later. And finally and simply, I'd like to share my passion for Richards with you because in my experience, there is no other historical American artist whose artworks have been more universally loved by both the connoisseur and the public at large. William Truss Richards was born in Philadelphia on November 14, 1833, the son of a Welsh tailor. He showed an artistic interest even as a young boy. One of his friends remembered that when they went to the creek, he would fish while Richards sketched. The premature death of the artist's father forced him to leave high school at age 13 to provide for his mother and siblings. His precocious talent allowed for a position designing gaslight fixtures for a Philadelphia company. By 1850, Richards started to study in his free time with Paul Weber, a German-born landscape artist who was living in Philadelphia. The two would go on sketching trips along the Wissahickon and Brandywine rivers and other rural areas around Philadelphia. In 1852, Richards first exhibits at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. His early paintings and drawings align him with the Hudson River School artist's belief in the sublimity of nature. Throughout the 1850s, the artist sketched in rural Pennsylvania and along the Hudson River and in the Catskills and Adirondacks. On the screen, we have seen early U.S. subject drawings from my collection. By 1854, he has left his design job and is painting full-time. In 1855, patrons financed a year-long trip to Europe, where he traveled in Paris, Switzerland, Italy, and in Dusseldorf, where he was exposed to precisionist German draftsmanship. Here are some wonderful sketches of Florence and the Alps from this 1855 sojourn that illustrate his skill as a draftsman. I heard Professor John Wilmerding lecture on American landscape painting once, where he referred to Richards as the greatest draftsman of the Hudson River School tradition. The artist himself is quoted as replying to a young student's query about how to learn to paint with the words, "learn to draw." And the artist's biographer, Harrison Morris, wrote of Richard's unerring draftsmanship, and that, quote, "only a draftsman of genius can draw with paint in that faultless and fearless manner." As I show two more drawings from our gallery collection, and I should note that unless otherwise noted, all the Richards artworks illustrated today come from my collection or things that I have sold in the past. I have one more quote to share with you on the subject of the artist's drawings. When Linda Ferber was searching for a title for a museum exhibition and catalog of Richard's drawings in 1986, she referenced an observation by the well-known 19th century critic, G.W. Sheldon, writing about Richards in the 1877 Art Journal. "His drawing is never at fault, and the crispness of his touch is charming." The title Linda chose was "Never at Fault," and in my view, that aptly describes all of Richard's artistic production. It was also early in the artist's career that he became intrigued by the work of the Pre-Raphaelite school, both in England and the U.S. Brotherhood, with their attention to meticulous detail, particularly in regard to elements of the landscape. The Pennsylvania Academy mounted an exhibition of British Pre-Raphaelite art in 1858, and Richards no doubt attended. One can see this influence on Richards in this wonderful 1860 oil landscape from the Bowdoin College Museum, and also from these vegetation pencil studies from 1860 and 1865. Returning from Europe to Philadelphia in 1856, Richards married Anna Matlock in a Quaker ceremony, and the couple settled in nearby Germantown. The Richards would have 8 children, 3 of whom died young. 2 of their daughters, Anna Mary and Eleanor French, were painters. Here is a portrait by Anna of her father. And in this portrait of Anna, by Anna, the seascape painting was in fact painted by Anna's father. It is signed by him, William Truss Richards. An interesting artistic collaboration. Here is a Matunic landscape by daughter Eleanor. In 1904, Richards had bought a camp among the hills and ponds of South County, Rhode Island, and the family continued to own the land for 50 years. Another Richards' son, Theodore Williams, was a Harvard chemistry professor who won the Nobel Prize. Throughout the 1860s, Richards painted primarily along the New Jersey shore, New England, and New York State, creating detailed naturalistic views of the picturesque landscape and seascape. Richards considered landscape painting very serious and spiritual business, and considered it, quote, "the foremost means for teaching and elevating human nature." Here is a large autumn landscape in the Adirondacks by Richards from 1865. And if you look closely at the signature and date, which is at the lower right, which I'm afraid you probably can't see, you would notice that the artist inscribed Philadelphia at the lower right. This fact illustrates an important point about the working technique of members of the Hudson River School. Landscape artists of Richards' generation would travel, generally in the warm months, and make plein-air studies from nature in both oil and pencil. The products of these excursions would later be used in the studio to create larger oil paintings for exhibition and sale, like the Adirondack landscape painted in the artist's Philadelphia studio. Now, as a chronological diversion, I'd like to show some examples of these plein-air sketches created on the artist's travels. I've sold dozens of these studies. They became available to me mainly by way of my association with Richards' family members. This is also true of many of the drawings that I have had. I theorize that several of Richards' descendants that I have known had collections of these artworks because they were not highly prized by earlier generations in the marketplace. So they were passed on from generation to generation. I think that the success that I have had in marketing these is in large part because of a modern change in aesthetic sensibilities that value quick, spontaneous, simple depictions of nature that capture the light and atmosphere of a moment in time firsthand out of doors, rather than a studied, finished studio painting created from memory and by referencing sketches. As these works were created out of doors and needed to be carried at times by the artist for long distances, they tend to be small in size. In fact, almost all of these works conform to several standard sizes, as the artist had the durable panels and boards pre-cut to pack in his paint box or travel case. I also believe that earlier generations of collectors considered plein air American drawings to be preliminaries to more finished works, while today they are in much demand. Richards prized his drawings, saw them as finished works of art, and carefully saved them so that future generations have been able to enjoy their fidelity to nature. And it's interesting to note in this plein air oil study that it was in fact painted by the artist on a Norwegian train schedule while he was traveling. Probably the best example of plein air painting that I know of. Richards took a second trip to Europe in 1866 and 1867. In his biography, Harrison Morris references a stormy Richards Atlantic voyage on this journey, which dramatically demonstrated the great power of the sea, forever influencing the artist's concentration on marine subjects. This is an 1872 very luminous Richards that I sold to the Detroit Institute a couple of years ago. And a wonderful historic depiction of the Portsmouth Light, whaleback light off of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, showing two versions of the lighthouse, the one on the left being an 18th century lighthouse, which was in decrepit form, and the newer lighthouse built in 1872. They remained extant only for a year, with the older one being demolished. So it's also a historical thing. Exactly how Richards found his way to Newport is not clear. It appears that he first visited in 1869 with the noted New York art dealer and collector Samuel P. Avery. He returned in 1871 and was in nearby Narragansett, we know, in 1872. Richard's biggest Philadelphia patron from the mid-1860s on was George Whitney, about whom we will learn more later. Whitney owned two Newport subject paintings by John F. Kensett, and Richards may have been impressed with the scenery depicted. He also would have been familiar with prints of Newport and paintings by many of the leading members of the Hudson River School who had visited Newport. Clearly, after the Civil War, Newport was known as a pleasant and attractive place to spend the summer, especially for an artist, with one period guidebook referencing the town's panorama of varied and beautiful scenery. Henry Marquand, art collector and president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, had a house here, where Richards was introduced to both John LaFarge and the artist Samuel Coleman. By the summer of 1874, Richards was a part-time summer resident with his wife and children, renting Dale's Cottage at the northeast corner of Gibbs Avenue and Old Beach Road, just blocks from here, overlooking Easton's Pond and Newport Beach. And here is a watercolor view dated 1874 of this home that no longer stands, from the collection of the Newport Historical Society. At this same time, Richards described Newport's appeal in an article where he wrote, "The atmosphere, sea and shore are unsurpassed in artistic qualities." In an 1874 letter to George Whitney, he contemplates a permanent move to Newport. He writes, "We have had for several years many talks about the desirableness of some changes that would obviate the necessity of always going away from home in the summer, but nothing till now has seemed feasible. The moving of a large family is always a burden and weariness to my wife. She is so charmed with Newport, with its climate and advantageous of living in every way, that she is more than ready for a change. My wife thinks I have reputation enough in the art market to stand, if not profit by change. And the country here is certainly very inspiring. Within a year, Richards purchased a home on Gibbs Avenue near the corner of Cathy Street for use in the summers, while continuing to spend time in Germantown and abroad. In the 1870s, Richards became more interested in watercolor as a medium for sketches and finished works. He was active in the American Watercolor Society and was from the start considered one of the leading watercolorists of his generation. In my view, he was the only member of the Hudson River School that was expert at painting in both watercolors and oils. There's a wonderful genre of watercolor off the coast of Jamestown. You can see Beavertail in the far horizon. And here's a wonderful gouache of Spouting Rock. Very interesting study done at Spouting Rock again with this technique that I mentioned Marion Carey earlier. Marion Carey told me that when she was studying, they actually were taught by their teacher to use the salt spray here to speckle the watercolor. Beginning in 1875, Richards began producing small coupon-sized watercolors in the Newport environments, and later on his travels, which he mailed in an envelope regularly, along with a letter to George Whitney, until Whitney's death in 1885. A successful industrialist, Whitney was the artist's biggest patron and one of the leading collectors in Philadelphia. Utilizing his fortune to support the arts, he maintained his own private museum on North 18th Street, which was open to visitors for viewing. 85 artworks by Richards were sold at Whitney's estate auction, along with many other works by American and European artists. The personal painted postcards, each measuring about 3 by 5 inches, were not in this auction and were preserved until their sale by the family in the 1970s to major New York collectors. Although it's not clear how many of these postcards were painted and sent to Whitney, 110 survive in this special collection. They were exhibited in 1980-81 at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in a fully illustrated catalog titled Tokens of a Friendship, Miniature Watercolors of William T. Richards, was published with an essay by Linda Ferber to accompany the very popular show. I know there were other tokens, as I have owned about a dozen through the years that were not part of the large exhibited collection. One knows when one of these miniature watercolors belonged to Whitney because he had a habit of inscribing each on the back upon receipt in the mail with his initials, date received, and sometimes the title or subject. And if you don't realize the size based on the screen, I brought one of my tokens with me. They're all this size, 3 by 5 inches. And you probably can't see it, but there in the back is Mr. Whitney's inscriptions upon receiving them. Several years ago, I was contacted by the curator for the private collectors who owned this collection, asking if I would be interested in selling them for them. I replied that I would be interested, provided I had the luxury to find a client who would keep the collection intact and then donate it to a public institution so that it would be preserved intact forever. I recognize that beyond the beauty of the individual watercolors, the collection as a whole told an important story about the relationship between the artist and his patron in 19th century America. I had a very generous client in mind who ultimately accepted my proposal. And recalling the artist's connections to Philadelphia and Newport, I actually suggested that the ultimate donation be made to the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, a large institution that could care for a large important collection of works on paper, but also recommended that the Newport Art Museum be granted preferential lending rights to the collection in perpetuity. The plan was a success, and this summer, the Tokens of a Friendship collection of 110 Richards watercolors will be exhibited here at the Newport Art Museum as part of the centennial celebration. Next fall, the collection returns to Philadelphia for exhibition there as well. It should be noted that were not for the regional mission that this museum professes and the high standing that it has earned in the art world, this coup of having the first fresh opportunity to exhibit one of the best known and important collections of one significant American artist's work would not have come to pass. Director Lisa Goddard, Curator Nancy Grinnell, all of the staff, and the Board of Trustees should be very proud of this accomplishment. You can see on the screen that some of the tokens were painted in England. To return to the artist's life, in 1878, Richards and his family traveled to England for a 2-year stay, staying in a London studio in the winter and exploring the coast in the warm months. Richards produced an important body of work on British subjects, and the sketches that he brought back to Newport would continue to inspire his work later in his career. It was foretelling that in 1878, the artist wrote to Whitney from the Cornwall coast that the dramatic subject matter was, quote, the realization of all that Connecticut hints at. On the screen are some views from Cornwall, and it's interesting in the plein air, if you can go back, Christine, in the plein air spirit to see the sketching in the lower left. I hope you can see the pencil going, and it's unfinished work from the family. And then this pentagonal painting from 1879 representing the dramatic formations where King Arthur's legendary castle was located. In Wales, in this wonderful watercolor that I bought from the family, which I believe is an homage to Turner. Turner worked at Conway Castle in Wales. Richards inserted the classic rainbow that one finds so often in Turner's work. And I actually think that the artist is depicting some of his kids walking there along the shore. And then finally, Dorset. I'd like to make a point about this last image in the series. The two watercolors of Lulworth Cove, Dorset. In the upper left is the small coupon that was sent to Whitney from Dorset by the artist. And then below you see the Whitney inscriptions that I mentioned earlier. But what's fascinating is the image to the right, which is a 22 by 36-inch watercolor version of the coupon image. And these came to me separately, which is also fascinating. And this illustrates, I believe, the business acumen of Richards. I've had several other large versions of the coupon scenes, which I suspect were commissioned by Whitney or his wealthy friends, who admired the subjects when they viewed them with Whitney in the small versions. So Richards was taking advantage of sending these small examples, hoping that maybe he might snag a commission. The large watercolor also reveals another interesting business decision by the artist. Around 1877, Richards became frustrated that the art market for his typical 8 by 13-inch watercolors lagged far behind the price he commanded for his oil paintings. He experimented for about 10 years with using commercial-grade carpet paper that came in large rolls, measuring about 24 inches high, which was the only large paper available at the time. He produced an interesting series of these carpet paper pictures, using both watercolor and gouache, a medium that adapted well to the rough paper. The depiction of vegetation and rock images were particularly successful in these artworks, which the artist framed like an oil painting without typical watercolor matting. And here's another example of the carpet paper watercolor, this being a Beverly Farms, Massachusetts view in the original frame. And yet another carpet paper watercolor that is an enlarged version of a Whitney coupon recently helped me to locate the Newport setting for my newest Richards oil painting acquisition called Dawn. What we're looking at now is the carpet paper picture, which I sold a number of years ago to a Newport client. And then the next image is the coupon. Unfortunately, I didn't have a color image of it, that belonged to Whitney, entitled On the South Shore, Newport. And then here's Dawn, a painting that I just recently acquired, which is the same location. And even with the same capital in the code. This is off of Christ's Neck on the Ocean Drive, and if you look at the next slide, I think that you can see the view there with that characteristic outcropping on the left. And Rentham House, or Busk House, by Richard Morris Hunt, up on that promontory, which most people are skeptical about, but without the vegetation and trees, those rocks tend to exaggerate the elevation. And the artist also would be prone to exaggerate natural topography. And now I'm especially pleased to show you what is the tour de force of the carpet paper series, Paradise Valley. And because of the Newport mission of the Newport Art Museum, about 10 years ago, I was able to convince Richard's descendants to donate half the value of this artwork, and our gallery raised the other half through donations in order to realize the dream to have this great example of historic Newport art enter the permanent collection here at the museum. In 2005, I was similarly successful in convincing two other Richard's great-grandnephews to change their intention to donate to a Maine museum a fabulously large, well-known Richard's Guernsey seascape, which we see here. These gentlemen shared a family trust summer home in Maine, and as that is where the painting hung, they thought that the donation plan in Maine was fitting. I convinced them otherwise, noting that Richards had spent only days in Maine, whereas he was Newport's one favorite artist. So the painting was given to the Newport Art Museum. Conservation of this masterpiece was just completed this month. In fact, I think a week ago. And fortunately, I have before and after photographs here that show the conservation. These two donations have significantly enhanced the already strong holdings of Richard's art in this collection. And I'm confident that the centennial celebration will attract many more such gifts of Newport art to support the mission of the museum. As it turned out, by the time that Richards returned to the U.S. from England with his family, the charming and beautiful Newport that appealed so much to his artistic sensibility had begun to change. In an 1880 letter to Whitney, he complained that the houses around him had grown like mushrooms, and he was no longer the last house to the beach. The next year, he writes again on the same subject. They have shut out all of my country views of fields and orchards. He also objects to the bigger and bigger and more fashionable houses being constructed in his neighborhood, complaining that all the charm of loneliness has gone out of our place, and it gives me an entirely different feeling. Finally, he proposes a solution to Whitney, and I quote, "Our friend, the agent for the estate of Connecticut, is trying desperately hard to get me to pioneer there. The pictures would be better and manier for it. Though there are now no houses on the particular tract in question, it is not far from Jamestown, and from there to Newport is a constant ferry, so that we could live easily enough. Certainly there is no place more lovely than Connecticut in all the world, and that it could never be as fashionable as Newport would be much to recommend it." Richards had painted on Connecticut since his arrival in Newport, as we see in this charming and romantic 1874 watercolor of Fort Dumpling. And I hope you're noticing that many of the Richards watercolors that I have owned and that I'm showing you today had as provenance George Whitney, who was a very prolific collector of Richards' work. So as it was, in 1881-82, Richards built a shingle-style house called Grey Cliff on a spectacular, desolate granite cliff overlooking the east passage of Narragansett Bay and the sea. You can spot the site today from Castle Hill in Newport by looking directly west to the Connecticut coast and find the lightning strike quartz vein in the gray rock, atop which sat Vareika. It's interesting to note, these photographs actually came in a copy of Harrison Morris's biography of Richards, which someone brought to me for sale. They had bought it in a bookstore in Cambridge, I think for $1. And when they got it home and looked at it, not only were these 4 little thumbnail original photographs of the house, the one in the lower right showing what may be one of Richard's grandchildren standing in front of it, but there were also a half a dozen original Richards drawings inserted into this book. And I obviously paid a lot more than this person did for it. The family moved in during the summer of 1882, but ironically his Philadelphia friends and others soon followed him and built large homes nearby. And here we see Joseph Wharton's home, which still stands Horsehead. Wharton, of course, was a good friend of William Truss Richards and a patron and fellow Philadelphian. Richards writes to Whitney, "The charm of solitude has gone forever, but the beauty of detail still remains, and nothing can destroy the deep satisfaction we have in our own little kingdom in the wide sea." This Jamestown, Connecticut locale proved a fertile source of subject matter for the artist. And I'm showing you several views, all of which were painted from the artist's home, looking towards Horsehead and Beavertail, a site that excited him and that he painted many, many times in both oil and watercolor. The family continued to enjoy summers at Great Lake until 1899, when the U.S. government took the land to build Fort Wetherall and demolish the home, as well as the nearby historic Fort Dumpling, which is actually, if you go back, actually noted. You can see Fort Dumpling up on the promontory there to the right of the seaweed gatherers. The family moved back to Newport to a home on Arnold Avenue that the artist had purchased for winter use in 1890. And there's the studio, which still stands behind the house. If you don't know Arnold Avenue, it runs off of Broadway north, just several blocks beyond the Newport Hospital. And note in this watercolor by the artist's granddaughter of the interior of the Arnold Richards home, the portrait that we saw earlier of Mrs. Richards. In 1884, Richards traded his Germantown home for a farm called Old Mixon in Chester County, Pennsylvania. This pastoral Brandywine landscape provided a new inspiration for the artist until he sold the farm in 1891. In 2001, the Brandywine Museum mounted a major exhibition of Richards' paintings and watercolors of this regional subject matter. This was followed in 2002 by a major exhibition of the artist's work produced in the Adirondack Mountains region, held at the Adirondack Museum. Another exhibition of Richards' drawings, watercolors, and oil sketches was presented in 2009 at the Cantor Arts Center at Stanford University. All of these exhibitions were accompanied by scholarly catalogs. Throughout the 1880s, 1890s, and the first half-decade of the 20th century, Richards continued to paint prolifically, dividing his time mainly between Chester County, Newport, Connecticut, and occasional sojourns to Britain and Europe. His travels brought him often to London and Cornwall, but also Guernsey, Scotland, the Orkneys, Surrey, Ireland, Paris, Venice, Amalfi, Capri, Naples, Norway, and Tacoma, Washington. In 1900, the artist's wife dies. 2 years later, Richard suffers a stroke, but continues to paint and travel. He had a remarkable career. He was elected to the Pennsylvania Academy in 1853 at age 20. In 1871, he was elected to the National Academy of Design. He was awarded a bronze medal at the Centennial Exposition in 1876. In 1885, he was awarded the Pennsylvania Academy's Temple Silver Medal. In 1889, he was awarded the bronze medal at the Paris Exposition. And in 1905, the Pennsylvania Academy, that venerable institution in his hometown, awarded him the prestigious Gold Medal of Honor, which I show here and which we actually have on display in a case in our gallery. Richard's large oils were commanding $2,500 in the 1890s. The art world was changing around him, and he continued to follow his own aesthetic instincts. Consider the paintings that Richards continued to create, as others were breaking new ground in art. Like the American Impressionist John Schwachman, painting Out in Paradise, a painting that's in our gallery collection. And this is what Richards is painting at the same time, right next door at Second Beach. Claude Monet, a painting that I sold several years ago to a small museum in the Normandy coast, painting in Impressionist style, while Richards is still producing works like this Sunset on the West Shore of Connecticut. And Picasso in 1896, while Richards is painting this. And as an aside, I should note that this Mackerel Cove painting sold at auction last May for $1.65 million, a world record for the artist. In the early 1980s, I recall when it was offered to the RISD Museum by the Jamestown family that owned it for about 10% of that price. Either RISD didn't value Richards enough at that time, or didn't have the funds, but they passed, and the painting was sold at auction in 1984 for $170,000. How the art market for Richards has changed in 28 years. It has been personally fulfilling to have witnessed this change during my time in the field and in Newport, and to have contributed in a small way to the favorable outcome. In the biography Masterpieces of the Sea, published in 1912, Harrison Morris reflected on his old friend. Richards has an uncommon grip on those affairs in his career, which brought his elder years into competence and substantial comfort. He well knew the worth of his canvases, while always denying them to two great qualities assigned by others. He always modestly put praise aside with an apt estimate of his own talents. He knew he could draw matchlessly, and yet there were elements in the portrayal of a breaking wave that he had never achieved to his own satisfaction. If you pressed him with the commendation on the side of drawing, he would shield his modesty behind his struggles with that miracle of color under the curving wave. He had studied this for years. His son tells us that he stood for hours in the early days of Atlantic City or Cape May, with folded arms, studying the motion of the sea, until people thought him insane. After days of gazing, he made pencil note of the action of the water. He stood for hours in a bathing suit among the waves, trying to analyze the motion. Edith Ballinger Price, daughter of Eleanor Richards, also recorded many memories of her grandfather. Here are her final recollections. On November 8, 1905, grandfather had worked very hard all day. He and my mother planned to go to Boston next morning by the early train for some shopping, checking up on dealers and galleries, and a short visit to Cambridge with Uncle Theodore, not yet a Nobel Prize winner, but deeply engaged in the research that led to it. There on the easel, in the growing dusk, was a noble 5-foot picture, the sky all but finished. The artist must get that sky in just the proper condition before it dried too much while he was away. So he worked until the November light failed, scraped his palette, cleaned his brushes, and thrust them in the thumb hole of the palette where they were to stay as he left them. William Frost Richards died in his Arnold Avenue home late that evening, 6 days shy of his 72nd birthday. He was waked in his parlor and buried in Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, the city of his birth. I hope that you will agree that Richard's spirit lives on, here at this century-old institution, in his adopted city of Newport, through the enduring quality of his art. And I guarantee that anyone familiar with his paintings can never again look at the sea without uttering the words, "It looks like a Richards." Thank you. Well, he was clearly connected to the Philadelphia crowd, as you know, as well as anyone. The Wharton family, and Cox and all their patrons. As you know, one of the reasons that Richards is more beloved, say, than Pensett or Whitridge or others who spent time here was because his children and grandchildren lived here. In the early days when I was working here at the Art Museum, Edith Ballinger Price was still around, granddaughter. In fact, I believe that some of the works in this collection may have come to the museum through her generosity. And so, it was at that time a connection sort of to the working class of Newport. So they were real Newporters, not in any time in the later 20th century. Summer colonists, but working Newporters. Yes?
Thinking of local aspiring artists, and those of us who can't buy things, big things, what do you see the supply and demand? Everybody at the wet paint contest seems to paint shore scenes and mansions and stuff like that. Do you have a wish list, and you see a latent demand in your customers for some other kinds of scenes around Newport?
Well, if you know about my business and my personal collecting, in our gallery we only deal in the work of historical artists, deceased artists. But my wife and I made a rule when we opened our gallery in 1987 that we would not compete. In addition, we had enough artist friends who, one in particular, took me aside one day and said, "Bill, you're making money selling the works of Richards and Lafarge and Pensett. Where would those artists have been without their patrons? You should be buying the work of living artists." And so if you come to our house, which was built in 1877, it's chock full of the work of living artists, although we're old enough now that some of the art that we bought by living artists is now in the historical category, but they were living at the time of the purchase. So you're talking to the right person in terms of asking the question, but it's not through my business. I bought hundreds of paintings through wet paint myself. Art is a very personal thing. Most of what I buy is traditional work by living artists, and of course the work that I sell historically. Though certainly have an open mind, and in terms of subject matter, I think in the 20th century, aesthetics changed in response to what was happening in the world, and so abstract art has its place, and subjective art as well. Does that answer your question? I wasn't quite sure exactly what you were...
Bill, maybe if you were an artist doing a wet paint scene this coming year, are there some untapped subjects around Newport that they can go out and...
Oh, well, I mean, I know that every year somebody seems to paint my house. I know I have a number of things. I think one should paint what moves them. There's certainly for 3 centuries, artists have found inspiration here in Newport and along the Narragansett Bay, and I'm sure wet paint artists will continue to do that. I always like to see paintings of the Griswold House when I come to wet paint. But
Bill, there's a widespread rumor, but I think a factual statement, that Richards helped lay out the windows in the house of Clingstone. Do you know that story?
I don't know that, no.
Well, apparently he knew the Hortons as well, you know. And apparently when they had the house in frame, he went out and said, you might want to put a window here, and you might want to put a window here.
Really? Well, I do know, and you may know better, and there are others here from Jamestown who know much more than I, but I believe Richards owned the rock. I think he it was put in his name, and then he sold it later to Joseph Warren.
I believe that.
I may be dreaming, so I'm getting old enough that I sometimes don't know whether I'm remembering the truth or a dream, but I think I was at Clingstone once and saw WTR carved in a beam out there.
Oh, no, that's a fact.
But I don't know about the windows, but that would make sense, although
well, if you go
I don't think he was, I don't think that he at any point thought that he would be living there or painting there, so it wouldn't have to do with north light or anything like that, but he certainly would be knowledgeable about where windows should go in terms of proper lighting.
Not so much lighting as seascapes, Bill, that everybody
I
see. Seascape.
Oh, of course.
It'd be nice to photograph some of them and see if it turns out.
That's in fact, you'd be looking at Richard's seascapes, I'm sure. Yes. Yes.
Would Richards title his own works with their locale?
He would at times, yes. Yep.
And other times that be...
Well, there would be more subjective paintings like the beach margin of the sea or something like that, more poetic titles.
Okay, but can that locale be figured out?
Oh, I've spent a career doing it, yes. And I will tell a joke without mentioning any names, but there are 2 brothers who live in Jamestown, and if I were to bring a Richards that I thought was painted on Connecticut to one of them for his imprimatur so that I could sell it as a Rhode Island view, I would be asked, what did my brother say? And if one said it was Jamestown, of course the other would say it was Cornwall. And of course, as you may know, in the marketplace, American views by American artists are generally more valuable than non-American views. So I would hope that I could prove that it was painted here in Rhode Island, but those sources were not always the best. I'm sorry, some titles were poetic, others were specific, and I have made a career of trying to identify where particular paintings were painted. I showed you the example of the research in terms of going out and photographing topography in order to prove a point that something was painted somewhere. But of course, as I said, in the tradition of the Hudson River School, these guys would go out and make sketches and then come back to a studio and produce a large painting. And the painting may have aspects that are derived from various sketches and not meant to be topographical.
Thank you.